We can do this without out there. Yeah. I think we're ready to start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Huntley. I'm the senior editor at the Pulitzer Center, and I see a few new faces this evening. So let me tell you a little bit about what we do. We're a journalism nonprofit. We give grants to journalists to cover what we call underreported systemic crises. We support about 80 journalism projects a year, and they appear across a variety of platforms. And just this past week, journalism produced by our grantees has appeared on NBC News, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Nation magazine, the Seattle Times, to mention a few. If we had been around in 1984, the year of the great Ethiopian famine, the starting point of our speaker's book, we may not have given any grants to send journalists to cover the famine. That's because once the ball got rolling on that story, there were plenty of people covering it. But we would have given grants to journalists to follow up on the story, to find out about the underlying causes of famine. Was it preventable? What can be done to improve the delivery of emergency aid? What kind of aid works best? In fact, that's exactly what we are doing today. We're today supporting numerous projects on food security around the world. Suzanne Franks, our guest this evening, has written a book that really dissects some of the impacts of media coverage on public policy, issues that are at the very heart of what we do at the Pulitzer Center. The book is called Reporting Disasters, and on the table outside you will find flyers that explain how you can purchase a copy. Suzanne is currently a professor of journalism at City University in London. Before that, she was a news and current affairs reporter for the BBC. She's also the founder of an independent production company that has produced several documentaries on Africa. Suzanne will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions. Suzanne?
Thanks very much. Thank you. So my interest, really, as an academic, is to understand how contemporary media report these faraway humanitarian crises. Really, what is it that makes us switch on and switch off? And the reason that the media is so significant in this area in particular is because they play such a role in constructing these crises so that they capture our attention. Because actually, if no one was present on the ground in a lot of these cases where this kind of crisis takes place, then we wouldn't know about it, because that's the only way that we can relate and understand them. We have no other means of knowing. So if a crisis isn't reported, it doesn't exist, except for those who are immediately affected. And actually, I came across a quote the other day saying that what the best journalists have in common is that they tell us things that we didn't even know we didn't know, and that's sort of really particularly the case in reporting far away emergencies. And the sort of way I kind of approached looking at this really was saying that how very random it is as to what kinds of things are covered and what kind of judgments we make about news. And this is a British view of the world. I couldn't find an American one, but this is a British one. Which looks at different countries according to how much news there is about them. So obviously there's lots about the UK, but also if you look at, we have lots and lots of news obviously about the United States, very little about Canada. It's just a little sliver there. And similarly, I mean, the reason I came to this, and what I'm really interested about is how we report Africa in particular. And then there's another version of this, which was in 2011, when things rather changed through the Arab Spring and the Arab, when all the Arab countries did hit the headlines to some extent. So then you've got a different view of the world. But again, still Africa, well, and also South America, were very squashed, and really didn't feature much in terms of news judgments. I mean, there is this phenomenon that journalists talk about all the time, this kind of randomness of what we call news values. Sort of which questions are we going to ask, and which stories are the ones that are going to hit the headlines. And it is a very, if you think about it, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this, it's a very haphazard process. And some journalists talk about this kind of rather cynically, this calculus of death, that a death in the next city is worth 10 deaths in the next country, which is worth 100 deaths in the same continent, which is worth 1,000 deaths in a faraway continent. And I know that's a very crude way of looking at it, but that often, if you look at the way that we make news judgments, there's a lot to be said for that. And I also came across a colleague of mine who was doing a project based on New York Times headlines, and there, it's not just kind of, if you look at one story, but where the story happens makes such a different series of judgments, and came up with this point that one Filipino is worth 22 Italians, and that was because of the way that earthquakes were covered in the New York Times, that the same amount of space and consideration was given to one death in a sorry, it's the other way around. Sorry, it's one Italian is worth 22 Filipinos. Sorry. And also in this country, you're pretty familiar with these sort of different judgments as opposed to where the story happens. Hurricane Katrina, as I'm sure you all know, was a huge story, hit the headlines not just at the time, but it's continued to reverberate. There have been many films and many images of Hurricane Katrina in the years that passed. But I wonder how many people remember, or even knew at the time, that there was a hurricane called Hurricane Stan, which happened in Guatemala. It was the same strength of hurricane, roughly the same amount of devastation, same numbers of deaths. Yet at the time, there were a couple of tiny stories about it, and since then it's completely disappeared off the news agenda and in the years to follow. So that gives you some examples of kind of this randomness of where stories happen and how news judgments are made. And then turning particularly where I'm most interested is if you look at Africa, as to kind of which stories matter and which stories are covered. There's many examples here of stories that completely disappeared, despite the fact that if they'd happened in other parts of the world, they would have been substantially significant stories to journalists. For example, the Angolan Civil War, where 500,000 people died, is something that is almost invisible in the wider world. And if you look at, if we go to North, I mean, there are many other examples I could have taken, but I'm just going to use three. The second one is in northern Uganda. If you look at Joseph Kony, that story was a huge devastation across the Lord's Resistance Army, across northern Uganda. It caused terrible suffering, and yet it only really came to any kind of international attention in 2012 when there was the Kony trial video. And a third example is the suffering in Darfur and the sort of ongoing crisis there, which for a period was actually significant and was pretty well covered and did capture the wider attention. And that one may well associate with the fact that it became a sort of celebrity disaster with people like George Clooney visiting there. What's happening in Darfur at the moment is just as bad as was happening in 2005, 2006, and yet it's now invisible to pretty much invisible to international attention. So this kind of randomness is something that's it's sort of enduring problem in the way we see the outside world. There's a lot of missing stories, which I've just talked about. And there's a phenomenon also called stealth wars, all kind of things that happen that just never make a kind of any kind of international impact. And in particular, the one example that sort of really strikes home about this is the kind of greatest humanitarian catastrophe of the 20th century was the famine in China, which took place in 1959 to 62. It's now estimated that probably about 40 million people died in that famine. But there are no pictures, there was no reporting at the time, and even in the years to follow, it was virtually an invisible story. There's been a little bit of coverage of it now in the last few years, but even today in China, this famine is called just 3 difficult years. It's not really something that people can talk about or that children are taught about at school. So that's the kind of sort of extreme example of a story that was completely invisible. And of course, it isn't just for sort of journalism itself that we should be paying attention to these kinds of stories. There's also, of course, a key link to fundraising and to the way that a story will then, if it captures international attention, will then be something that people are willing to donate to and willing to support. And the example I want to talk about here was the Niger famine in 2005, which was, although it wasn't the most devastating, was quite a serious episode. And it didn't get any kind of international attention to start with. In May of that year, the UN launched an appeal to try and raise funds for Niger, $16 million. A couple of months later, only $3.5 million had been raised. But then, 3 days after that, there was a huge BBC report on Niger. The reason the BBC went there at that time is that it actually coincided with the G8 summit. And the G8 summit was talking about sort of Africa, and so they wanted to go and find somewhere that they could do a story. And they just happened to go to Niger, sent a report back on the famine, and lo and behold, a week later, the $17 million had been raised, which exceeded what the UN had asked for. So that gives an example of why it's significant, why media coverage is so significant, aside from just being able to tell stories, that the kind of impact that it can have. So what I want to do now is to sort of use some of those themes and to talk about a particular episode, which, I mean, I know it's some time ago, it's 25 years ago, the famine, but the reason it's worth talking about this is that the research I managed to do is I've used freedom of information requests, and I've been able to go into the BBC archive, both not just the visual archive, but the written archive, which has been closed before, and a lot of government papers and so on, and to really look at what was actually going on at that time. Because if you use history and you've got historical insights, you can actually find out what people were really saying and what ministers and governments were really trying to do. And that's in many ways gives you a better insight than if you try and report on the present, where a lot of these things are more difficult to uncover. So this was a famine, as probably most of you know, that took place in the early 1980s, and was then covered by a BBC journalist, Michael Burke, and then the report that he made then went right around the world, and it's shown straight away on BBC here, and then it's shown on 425 channels across the world. And I just want to show just a little bit of this, just to give you a flavour for what this footage actually contained, and why it's such a okay, so this is a flavour of this report that went out on this Ethiopian famine in 1984. There. Yep. That's right. There you go. Oh, yeah. Beautiful. Where did it go? There we go.
It was going an hour ago. So
Yes.
it was taking its time. I'll show them on that. The power of the internet.
Shall I do it again? Shall I open it?
No.
No. Let it just.
This is the Ethiopian download speed. So
It's all right, an hour ago.
I think so.
Yeah, you should try reloading the whole page.
Yeah.
Sometimes it-
And maybe yeah.
Yeah.
No, just press refresh.
We were good about an hour and a
In Ethiopia,
half.
7 million people are threatened by starvation. Thousands have already died. The famine caused by drought is the worst in living memory, and now the rains have failed again for the 3rd year in succession. The relief organisations are doing all they can, but there just isn't enough food to go around. One of the worst hit areas is in the north of the country, where the problem has been complicated by 2 secessionist wars in Eritrea and Tigray. 40,000 refugees have converged on the town of Korum in the hope of getting some food and medical aid. Our correspondent Michael Burke has been back to Korum after 4 months, and he found the situation far worse.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Korum, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th century. This place, say workers here, is the closest thing to hell on earth. Thousands of wasted people are coming here for help. Many find only death. They flood in every day from villages hundreds of miles away, dulled by hunger, driven beyond the point of desperation. 15,000 children here now, suffering, confused, lost. Death is all around. A child or an adult dies every 20 minutes. Korum, an insignificant town, has become a place of grief. The relief agencies do what they can. Save the Children Fund are caring for more than 7,000 babies. Every day they weigh them on a sling, then compare their weight with their height. By this rule of thumb, 1 in 3 is severely malnourished, starved to the point of death. This morning another 114 babies have arrived. The choice of who can be helped and who can't among the constant stream of newcomers is heartbreaking. There's not enough food for half these people. Rumours of a shipment can set off panic. As on most days, the rumours were false. For many here, there would be no food again today. 2 months ago, there were 10,000 people here. Now the latest harvest has failed, there are 40,000. There's nothing like enough food in the country, not enough transport to move it if they want. These people have waited all morning. They want food, they're getting clothes. Those naked and most needy are marked by a pen stroke on their foreheads before the distribution begins. An armed guard sits on the small bundles of cast-off clothing sent from countries in Europe. A few jackets, trousers and sweaters, once worn in the wealthy West, now handed out to starving people who have to live in the open through nights when the temperature drops below the freezing point. Today, only a tiny amount of grain is being given out to those who have brought in firewood. People scrabble in the dirt as they go for each individual grain of wheat. For some, it may be the only food they've had for a fortnight or more. The Ethiopian government tries to persuade these people to go home, but that would make death certain. Better to camp here. Some of the very worst are packed into big sheds. 7,000 now, most apparently dying of malnutrition, pneumonia, and the diseases that prey on the starving. This 3-year-old girl was beyond any help, unable to take food, attached to a book, but too late. The book was taken away. Only minutes later, while we were filming, she died. Her mother had lost all her 4 children and her husband. The situation is out of control. Whole groups are being ignored. These people have been without food for a month. a government truck arrived to pick up those most desperately ill and take them to the sheds that are already overcrowded. It was a quick and rapid thing. They took a handful, but hundreds here needed the food and shelter the sheds provide. Those left behind seemed at least as bad as the...
Sorry, it's actually 7 minutes long. I think I'd better stop there, but you can see it on the BBC website. But so the very fact that this was a 7-minute long item, and it went round at the top of the news. And remember, there are only 3 bulletins a day at that point, so it ran at the top of both the lunchtime and the early evening and the nighttime news. And then similarly, I mean, they didn't run it at 7 minutes in the United States, but they ran it at 3.5 minutes, which in those days was still considered pretty significant. And as I said, it went round. It was 425 stations around the world, all picked up on this story. So it was and ran that same footage. And actually, NBC ran it even with the British commentary, which I gather was sort of almost unheard of. So this, in a sense, this footage broke all the rules that I've just been talking about. This was a very far away place. This was unknown black people, and there wasn't even a colonial connection with Ethiopia, because Ethiopia wasn't ever colonized. It's not like the Angola war I mentioned before in Portugal would have been covered at least a little bit. So this was an extraordinary confluence of different reasons why this coverage became so massive. And I devoted a whole chapter in my book to sort of talking about why did this footage, you know, there's lots of terrible things happen every day in all sorts of parts of the world, but why did this hit the headlines in this particular way? And you know, and I can go into that a bit more if you're interested. But partly it was because this story was filmed as a scoop, and the sort of research then that I've done in the using freedom of information looks at kind of four fallacies which have all got implications as to later crises. The 4 fallacies, the way this story broke and the way it was then covered. Sort of using historical documents, I've sort of been able to come to some insight into that. So the first thing, as I just said, is that this was reported as a sudden news event. There's a famine. Quickly, we must break this news story and tell the rest of the world about it. But if you think about it, famines are not and can never be sudden news events. This is something that had been going on for years beforehand. The Western governments all knew about it. The Ethiopians knew about it. The NGOs were trying to persuade governments, the Western governments, to tell them about it, but nobody was really very interested. And when the news broke, on the day after this news broke, there was an emergency debate in Parliament in the UK saying, "Oh, there's a famine. Gosh, we must do something. We must send some funds or be seen to be doing something." But actually, the documents show that the government, the UK government and the American government, knew perfectly well for many years that there was terrible suffering going on in Ethiopia, and that this famine was happening. But it was simply when the media got the story in the way that I showed you, the government wanted to be seen to be doing something, so they announced this money that they were suddenly going to send, which they, as I say, the NGOs have been pushing them, and even some junior government ministers have been trying to get the more senior people to take attention. The ambassadors have been writing dispatches saying we must do something here, but it was not convenient, and that was completely ignored. So the real date of the famine isn't 1984 at all. It should really be seen as 1982 to 1985, because it was really a famine that had been going on for a long time. So that's the first fallacy, that famines in particular are not news events. And then the second thing is that the way that the famine was actually framed and that the story was told. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, has written very eloquently on this whole fact that famines are not natural disasters. Famine is a social and a political phenomenon. Famine is really a problem of food availability. There's a decline in availability to certain vulnerable groups within the population. There's always plenty of food. I mean, we don't have famines in lots of parts of the world when there's a drought, for example. But it's the fact that certain poor parts of the population they lose their entitlements to be able to access food. And that's really what a famine is. And that has a crucial relationship with a free press and with a government that can be pushed by democratic means in order to be seen to care enough about its population to do something. So you get this phenomenon that famines don't occur in a democracy, and they also don't occur where there's a free press. And it was Amartya Sen really that made these connections and showed us that famine is really a social and a political phenomenon, not a natural disaster. However, if you noticed at the beginning of that report, the news anchor introduced the story by saying that there's a famine as a result of drought. Famines are not results of drought. A drought might be one participating factor, but famines only happen where there's a deliberate social and political background where the availability of food is not allowed to reach those vulnerable individuals. So the second fallacy I want to talk about really is this causation of famine and seeing famine as a result of drought. And it's wrong to sort of have that simplistic connection. But again, if you look at the government papers at the time, they formed, this was in the UK government, they formed something called the Ethiopian Drought Group to kind of deal with this situation on the day after the news broadcasts hit the headlines, the day after the Michael Burke broadcast. And then all these high-level meetings as to how we can deal with it were called, as I say, it was under the heading of this Ethiopian Drought Group. So even the kind of inside government, that's the way it's being characterised. And of course, it suited the Ethiopian government very well to say that, oh, it's all the fault of bad rainfall. So that's why these people are starving. What was completely missing from the story and from the whole sort of framing was that Mengistu, who was the dictator of Ethiopia at the time, was fighting a very vicious insurgency against these groups in the north of Ethiopia, and it actually suited him that these populations in Tigray, in particular in Eritrea, were starving. But that story never got out. That story was never told. The way that this story was framed and the way that it continued to have impact was that it was all a sad fact that there wasn't enough rain, and therefore this caused the suffering. So the second fallacy, as I said, is famine is not a natural disaster, but a social and political phenomenon. But it suited the NGOs to tell a simple story. Much easier to fundraise if you're telling a very straightforward, simple story. And it suited both the Western governments and the Ethiopian government to tell that simple but wrong story. And the third fallacy I want to talk about is you look at how the government responded, what kind of aid was being sent from the West. And again, if you look at the documents there and you look at what was actually going on, the government, the UK government, and this also was the case with the United States, didn't want to be seen to be helping a communist country in any way that they didn't have to. They wanted all the time to be seen that the country, it was the fault of the Soviet Union and it was in their domain, and they should be helping the Ethiopians. And the only kind of aid that was actually sanctioned by Mrs. Thatcher was sending airlifts, because that made for great images, and that was involved in just dropping food onto the ground, which any aid worker will tell you is incredibly wasteful, and really it's something you only do if there's absolutely no other alternative. But it made for great images. It showed the sort of brave soldiers with flags, and there was all this TV crews on board there to show these images. But anything that the NGOs on the ground really wanted in terms of sort of much more complicated long-term aid was completely dismissed, because of the Cold War sort of background to this story, that nobody in the West, and particularly these two leaders, wanted to be seen to be giving any help that they could avoid to any kind of a communist country. So although the public story was that all these Western governments are being incredibly generous and they're all helping these poor, starving individuals, actually, when you look at the documents and you look at what was really going on, they were trying to do as little as they possibly could, and the very few things they did do were done for sort of for other wider geopolitical reasons, to make themselves look good in terms of their sort of public perception. And that even the case that the money they said was being given, I found through the documents that actually it was actually existing money, and there was a whole lot of fighting between the Department of Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Office, which oversaw the kind of aid budget at that time. Actually, the money that the public thought was being given actually wasn't, and it was being taken from their budgets, and then there was a sort of nasty infighting, which, as there usually often is, between two departments, saying, actually, no, you're going to take it now, because there's no extra money for this. So that's the third fallacy, that official aid isn't really what it seems, and it wasn't being necessarily delivered for the benefit of the suffering people, but for it was being done for other foreign policy goals. Which brings me to the last sort of fallacy in the way the story has been told, and that was this whole idea of which underpinned all the private philanthropy, which is all about, I'm sure some of you remember this, some have seen pictures of it, of this idea that we were going to be saving Africa. That if you went to a pop concert, the Live Aid concerts, or these songs, Band Aid, or We Are the World, which were these incredibly popular songs that Bob Geldof raised money on the back of. That was a way that ordinary individuals could put their hands in their pockets and they could be seen to be saving the starving in Africa. And the problem there is that it led to this kind of, or the way the story was being told was very much this kind of reporting without any political background. Again, it was told as a very simple story. If you buy this music, or if you come to the concerts, and later in later years, if you buy the wristband and all the other things, that you'll be saving the starving. You just need to do that, and that's going to save the starving. But no political context, no wider understanding of what this very complicated story really involved, and why this was happening in the first place. So that's the fourth fallacy, is this need to kind of engage with the politics. And this is really a problem that I trace back, going right back to the Biafran War, which is these are the images. This is the first time really that kind of very, very powerful images caused a sort of worldwide consternation. But actually, as in Ethiopia, the story got completely wrong, and it really wasn't what we thought of it at the time. And these kind of images were being manipulated, and actually resulted in this Biafran War lasting much longer than it should have done, and a lot more suffering. But that complicated story was not being told because of this sort of lack of understanding of wider politics. And this leads to a whole phenomenon. I'm watching this video now. There's a very good clip here, which is this idea of oh dearism. It's not telling a proper political story, but it's just, oh dear, there's another catastrophe here. Let's tell a simple story and send some money and we'll sort it out. And that's very, very much in the sort of post-1989 period, this dismissing of a sort of political context and just seeing each humanitarian crisis as a sort of a separate episode of suffering where there's no sort of political background or political context. And you get to this situation now where you get this sort of framing of really disaster reporting, the starving child, and these are all the ingredients that you need for the disaster, the feeding centre and the white aid worker. And in that clip I showed you before, if we'd gone on a bit longer, the only person who actually talked was a white aid worker. Nobody else, none of the actual individuals themselves was ever allowed to speak. And then you get the reporter who's breathless and saying it's all terrible, and he's going to sort of expose this to the world. So this kind of very, very simplistic reporting is, as I said, a great danger here. And then that links to the way that the aid agencies tell the story. That again, it's a very simplistic. If you just you see this nameless individual, and if you just send some money, then you're going to make it better, and you can feel good about yourself, and they'll be saved, and they'll be fine. The kind of much more complicated political context to all of this is very, it's very more difficult to tell, and it's very often missing. So you get this, what I call humanitarianism without the politics, not long-term solutions, and this story of just hopeless victims waiting to be saved. So I would say that each of these themes is something that still endures very much today. There's still quite a bit of simplistic coverage. I'm sure not kind of coverage that you support here in the Pulitzer Center, but particularly in the way that African stories are told. And you get these points, these 4 points that I made, which I just want to emphasise again, that famine is not a natural disaster or a sudden event. The social and political context so often needs to be explained. We need to remember that politics underpins everything and underpins even what might be seen as a sort of natural phenomenon, and that we need to be aware of what kind of aid is being sent and actually who the aid is ultimately going to benefit. Thank you very much.
Suzanne. We'll open it for questions now, but I'm going to ask the first question. We have, at the moment in Syria, all of those ingredients for a disaster. We have dying children, we have white aid workers, we have journalists covering the story, and it's undeniably a huge crisis. And it gets some coverage, but it just hasn't at all kicked in as a story. You know, what's missing? What's the missing ingredient? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think you know, besides this kind of obvious kind of compassion fatigue points, I think the problem in Syria is, and it sort of relates to something I just said a few minutes ago, is that it's a very, very complicated story. There's not a goodie and a baddie. There's a baddie, Assad, and then on the other side, there's lots of different shades of grey, and you know, there's several different you know, contenders there. And I think if a story is told as a kind of, you know, black and white, good and bad, it's much easier for it to gain traction. But Syria very much is not that story, and I think that's the kind of problem. And it's very difficult for journalists to somehow catch on to that, and particularly for aid. I mean, I know that when they tried to raise funds for that in the UK, it's been miserable. It's done very badly indeed. I assume it's the same here.
So it's a strange case of most journalists grasping the complexity of the story, explaining it fairly well, and that's killing the story, killing the aid, the potential for raising funds.
I think that's very, very much the case. Yeah, I mean, natural disasters are always much easier to find. You know, what we call natural disasters, but I don't think there's such an easy dividing line always between what's natural. I mean, there's a lot of starvation now in Syria, but that's not a natural disaster. And I think that, well, some journalists have done a very good job and have tried to tell the story as you say, but I mean that's turning the point off.
You make a good point in the book. There is no natural disaster, and an earthquake's a natural disaster, a tsunami. But you say no.
Well, an earthquake in San Francisco has completely different impact from an earthquake in the Philippines, and you know, there is a social and political background to that. You know, if you have a proper infrastructure to get emergency aid to people, if you have buildings that are properly, you know, proper foundations and that kind of thing. I mean, all those are social and political phenomena. So that's why, you know, earthquakes, you know, even when there's another earthquake in San Francisco, I would predict it will be nothing like, you know, some of the earthquakes we've seen in the last few years.
Right, I had a truly impressive hurricane named Sandy with massive coverage.
Yes.
And then one in the Philippines.
Yes.
A year or two later, much higher.
Yes. Yes. Or in fact, there's an even closer example to that. What became Hurricane Sandy had originally hit Haiti earlier on, and I've seen some coverage of that. I mean, it had devastating effects in Haiti as it came up. But I mean, nobody really heard about that, and that's the impact is still being felt today. You know, this is quite separate from the earthquake that it had, but Hurricane Sandy then a year later. But of course, when it hit New York, that's different.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is there anything specific that you, and I haven't read the book, that would characterize the coverage of Africa as a whole continent? Obviously, Ethiopia, you know, is a very small contribution in that context. On how we view Africa based upon coverage, and the historical background between the West and the continent of Africa and how that influences the successful factors related to famine coverage and why they work.
Well, I mean, I've written endlessly about how we cover Africa. I mean, even the whole concept of Africa, the idea that we think of 54 countries as sort of one thing like that, it's completely mad. I mean, you know, we don't talk about covering Asia in the same way. I mean, the way that Africa is framed by a lot of Western countries is completely inadequate. That leads to very simplistic reporting, and it leads to this whole phenomenon that's called Afro-pessimism, that always going to these same stereotypes. But now there's another narrative, which is Africa rising, and you get that all the time, which that, you know, the mobile phone's going to save Africa. But I mean, there's such simplistic concepts, and we wouldn't do that for other countries. And actually, there's a colleague of mine came up with this whole thing called the New Orleans syndrome. That if you think about countries like Ethiopia, if I say Ethiopia, most people will think of famine. But if you say New Orleans, you don't just think of hurricanes. You think of all sorts of other things that you associate with, you know, a nice place and jazz and, you know, good food and that kind of thing. And it's just this kind of one-dimensional, stereotypical framing of a story, which leads to that kind of mindset.
When
Go ahead.
okay. So when the 200 or something Nigerian girls were abducted about a week or two ago, there was a big flurry on social media where everyone was tweeting like hashtag Save Our Girls, and there was tons of social media.
But not to start with. When they were first, I don't think that's the case. I mean, when they were first abducted, there was very little coverage at all.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, you're right. There is now. Yes.
Yeah. There's a big social media flurry. And one of the things, Teju Cole is a writer who I really like, and he tweeted in response to this whole campaign something like along the lines of, unless you're a Nigerian with the constitutionally endowed rights of that country, that you essentially can't do anything about this. So let's say applying this to famine in an African country, let's say we do get really good reporting that does acknowledge the social and political factors leading to famine. What then? Is Teju Cole's response essentially the same for famine as it is for adopted girls in Nigeria?
Well, I think, I mean, the reason that Amartya Sen says that famine can only happen in a country with a free press means that you can, you know, there can be impact. I mean, the point is that in this situation, there was no free press in Ethiopia. It was a very, very authoritarian country. But then even having coverage from outside, it can have a diluted effect onto local political goals. And in fact, 10 years before this famine, there was another terrible famine in Ethiopia in 1973. And there was a famous documentary made by then, which by accident this journalist managed to get in and made a very powerful documentary. I think it's still in black and white, but called Jonathan Dimbleby. He made this called The Unknown Famine. And that, for some reason, Haile Selassie, who was the emperor at the time, let little bits of it be shown on Ethiopian television. And that led to his demise. He was then overthrown, killed. The whole of the ruling, this very autocratic ruling family was killed in Ethiopia as a result of this footage, which somehow found little bits of it found its way onto Ethiopian television. So that, I mean, then of course there was another nasty dictator came after that. But at the time, it seemed as that was a kind of, you know, there was a huge impact from that. But I take your point. Obviously, that's what activists and human rights activism is all about. That you've got to get the people who can actually make change themselves, who are the local population.
I had a contribution to that.
Yeah.
Sort of about 1973 times, because knowing Ethiopia a little bit, again, that's not the whole story. And in fact, he was losing power. That's why they use it's like some of the ads here, political ads. That's what they use it as, because they cut him feeding his dogs, which he loved dogs, with the famine pictures. And that was used almost as a political ad. So it wasn't really just a documentary. So again, maybe that's too Western a way of looking at it. Jonathan Dimbleby, that, you know, led to the downfall and murder of the emperor. It's far more complicated than that, always. And
yeah, it was amazing that they even allowed any bits of this.
well, he was already losing power, so that's it.
Sure,
So the television was almost out of his hands.
Yeah.
So he was already being overthrown even at that stage.
Yeah.
So I think just as famine is a nuanced issue and that it's often man-made, often caused by war, has all of these different contributing factors, I think that the way it's covered has a lot of contributing factors, and one of them is that, as you mentioned, a lot of times people just don't care. That there's the cycle of news just keeps on rolling. So how do you really make a change? You almost have to go to the education system to get people's attention to what do you think is your proposed
in Western countries?
Yeah, in Western countries, what's the solution? Because journalists could crank out the best reporting, the most nuanced reporting, and if people aren't interested, they just won't read it. So what do you think? What can we do?
Well, I mean, yes, it is a problem, but it's quite interesting because of this famine, they did care. I mean, there was the amounts of money raised for this, and the kind of the ways of fundraising that, you know, this whole new genre of fundraising was born out of this famine, and people did care.
But then the problem is journalists are journalists and not aid
not.
marketing strategists.
No, and they shouldn't be aid marketing strategists, and I think that's a mistake as well. That if they see themselves too close to that, I mean, journalists are there to tell the story. But no, I mean, I take your point about sort of more recent facts where people have tried to sort of raise awareness more, and then there is much more of a sense of compassion for it. But it's quite interesting because there was the Julius Nyerere, who was the leader of Tanzania for many years. He once said to the head of Oxfam, he said, "I wish you'd take all the money that you are using in our country and spending on various projects, and you go and spend it back in your countries, educating your populations about what the real inequalities are and what they can do." And he said he actually said that will be a lot more use to us than the projects you are funding here, which is kind of really interesting. But so, which alters your point that somebody sitting there in Africa could have a view that education was the most important thing that could be done.
I kind of want to go back because I was originally going to ask a question about the Boko Haram story, and I was going to say that I bet you have some criticisms about the way that Western media is covering it. I'm wondering if it's not a little too simple there as well, and that you do have kind of like this evil, Boko Haram, and then the guy who came up and said, "I'm going to sell your daughters," or that kind of thing. I'm wondering maybe even that is a little bit too easy of a narrative, but it's obviously a simple one. Or do you have any other criticisms of the way it's getting told right now?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of you're caught either way, aren't you? I mean, you're right, it is being told very simply now, but it has caught the public imagination. So maybe you have to sacrifice and make a balance somewhere there. But I mean, the point is that it wasn't being told at all. And if that had been a private girls' boarding school, in this country or in the UK, you can bet if 100 and whatever girls were taken out of their dormitories at night, it would have hit the headlines, instantaneously.
Two or one. If one was taken.
But if one was taken out, yes, that's legend. Yeah, absolutely. So you can be very critical that why did it take? I mean, it's really been propelled into the headlines now, and obviously it is being told as a very simple story, which is why it stayed in the headlines and it has caught people's imagination. So I don't know, maybe you say that one can't be too precious about it. But I mean, the same was true with Coney 2012. I mean, that was so simplistically told, and that was a huge story that had been completely missing all the time, and then suddenly that video caught on and everybody could like it on Facebook.
And that was after his forces were
involved. He wasn't he was in Sudan by then. So I don't know. I mean, I suppose one could argue in the current circumstances maybe better to be told that way than not to be told at all.
More broadly, do you think the internet has had a positive effect? I mean, you mentioned Coney 2012 and that it was fairly meaningless. But it still it allowed a story that wasn't being told by the mainstream media to rise to the public mind. Do you think the internet's had a sort of positive and democratizing effect on the reporting of these kind of issues?
Well, I mean, there's lots of good and bad examples. I mean, like if you go back to the Nigerian story, it was the internet then that did propel it. So in those sorts of areas, if you think that's a good thing, it probably is a good thing. The internet has had a positive effect. But I mean, there's lots of other. I mean, the Kony 2012, it made this sort of distinction between kind of what's called slacktivism or clicktivism and actual real activism. I mean, you know, in the days when people would actually go out on the streets or sort of march or demonstrate, you know, that's showing a totally different political engagement than this idea that you can sort of click a button and you feel good about yourself because you supported Kony 2012. So I think that there is a danger in the internet sometimes, you know, leading to these sort of false scenarios.
So to kind of follow up on that one as well, and you know, there's certainly been some positive benefits of the internet, of having all this multimedia news and so forth. But one of the things that it's funny that, you know, it came to this today, because I really was just this morning kind of reading the BBC on my smartphone, and it occurred to me that, you know, it's like sometimes I go there and I read these stories that I don't see in the American press whatsoever. They just don't go to. In fact, like you said, like we were not covering this case about the 200 Nigerian girls being kidnapped. I wonder if, but you know, because people are not.
Well, we didn't either. So.
Oh, really? But it was, I mean, I did hear about it weeks ago, and I don't remember what I was reading, but at the time, but you know, we don't sit down and like read the newspaper in broadsheet format anymore and come across stories about Africa that we might have otherwise, because, you know, our delivery systems become so personalized, and I wonder if that's, you know, how much of an impact that seems to be.
I think that's a huge issue. I mean, you know, we talk about globalization and that we're all sort of so engaged and interested with things all over the world, but there's also this phenomenon of localization that you can. I mean, there's lots of examples of that. Say if you were, I don't know, a migrant from somewhere and you came to live in this country, you know, in the past you'd just have to get on with it, and you'd have to, you know, absorb American news or you know, be part of what was going on around you. Now you can just watch channels from wherever you come from. You can stay totally connected to that, which is great in many ways. But it means you don't, this kind of serendipity, as you say, of just coming across something, you know, unless you're going to make yourself open to that, isn't necessarily going to happen. You're just going to consume the news of the particular channel that you're interested in. You know, if you're right wing, you're just going to look at Fox News, or if you're left, you know, the much more kind of chance coming across things for a wider population, which is what you're talking about, is I think, you know, often less likely. Obviously, it's different for people who are really interested in something. It's fantastic now what you can find through the internet, and if you're, but that's once, you know, you're actually engaged and you go looking.
I wonder if that reinforces some of the stereotypes you were talking about as well, because if you're getting news source, you just.
You mean if you're just only ever watching Fox News?
Or or maybe if, like, you know, when you actually do come across things about Africa, it'll fit into that, like either Africa Rising or past decades.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
How much do you go into in the book the effect of something like this on a country like Ethiopia, the actual Western coverage and sort of the way the image is created?
Yes, no, I do actually, and you talk to people there. I mean, you know, there's great anger, obviously, and frustration that you're just characterised all the time through that narrow frame. But I mean, there was anger on all sides. I mean, Mengistu was furious that this image of his country got out. But then much more sort of, you know, broad-minded, you know, reasonable people who write about Africa and now I find. I mean, you must know that now today in Ethiopia, that people don't resent the fact that internationally this.
They do actually.
Yeah, they do, absolutely, and they're still very angry.
Students, even the students who were hardly alive, you know, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, they're not alive. They still feel very sore about it.
Yeah. No, I've come across people who said that before. You know, and it's a real problem, because I mean, there's this idea that, you know, that Africa. I mean, if you talk to people on the street here, or probably in London, about Africa, you know, there's this continual image of the baby with the flies around its eyes, the shed, and all of that kind of thing. Whereas, and when you show them pictures of what Nairobi actually looks like, you know, the stock market and the, you know, sort of fashionable stores and all the other things that go on there, they almost kind of can't get it in their head that that's.
No, there's comments on social media that Ethiopian Airlines was a very successful airline, partly instigated by the Americans, but you know, doing serve food on planes, you know, it's amazing. Still, after 30 years, it's a very powerful image
no, it
that
is
was
that,
projected.
yeah. No, I mean, that's why I found it such an interesting thing to look at, because it, you know, it resonates still today.
I was just wondering, had you presented your book to some of the people who were involved in aid agencies raising money during '84 at Geldof, and what were their reactions?
No, I haven't presented it to Geldof because he won't talk about it because he's got a different view. But yeah, no, I have done. Yes, no, I have talked to aid agencies, and in fact, I'm doing an event in a couple of weeks at the Hague Book Festival in the UK with the head of Oxfam. Well, we're going to sort of debate this, and I've done a couple of other things like that. So, I mean, some of the more enlightened ones, particularly Médecins Sans Frontières and people like that, do accept that, this wasn't quite what we thought it was, or what a lot of people think it is, and that there needs to be a much more nuanced interpretation.
And the fact that in Addis Ababa they have a rainy season that lasts for 4 months, and it rains every day, solidly for 4 months.
Yeah, indeed.
Is that what you would imagine?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think that aid agencies have changed at all? I mean, we saw a Somali famine just, I guess, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Just from reading looking at the news, did you see a marked difference between the way the '84 famine was covered and the Somali famine just recently?
Do you know, I really didn't. And some of the same things, this whole idea of the way the famine was written about and the way that it was treated as a story, a sudden breaking news story, and all of that was really interesting, because that was just when I was sort of finishing writing this. It was kind of, I was worried that what I was writing about was really a bit historical. Will people be interested? But it's actually still so current. And I did an event at the sort of main kind of foreign policy think tank in the UK, and somebody there had done a whole. He was an academic researcher on food security, and he'd actually studied the Somali famine. And we did a kind of a discussion together, and he said, actually, frankly, you could just sort of cross out the word Ethiopian a lot of the time and put Somali to 2011, and it wouldn't make any difference.
Maybe part of the problem is they looked in 1984 and saw how successful that reporter was.
It is, but it is. Absolutely, you're totally right. I mean, your breaking news story. I mean, that's the way that when I referred briefly to that Niger famine story in 2005, she did exactly the same, Hilary Anderson. Exactly. Oh my goodness! Somebody arrived in Niger. Look at this. Isn't it terrible? Did anybody know about? And she had the same starving babies, and it was just—it's almost like it's a kind of template. Well, it's the template I showed you. It's the kind of disaster, which came from a conference that a well-known reporter spoke at, and he came up with those four criteria of these are the ingredients for your disaster reporting, And another colleague of mine at the BBC calls it instant coffee journalism. You kind of just put the powder in and stir it up, and there you've got it all.
This isn't tycoon, I think. No, the templates get tiresome. And there have been plenty of them, but the original that you showed, I mean, it's 30 years old, and it's still incredibly compelling. It does everything right, even though looking at it in hindsight, it's simplistic. It makes some mistakes.
Well, and it only interviews this one white French aid worker, and that's it. It doesn't talk to these people who are actually suffering.
You still remember the first word I said to me? Dawn.
Yeah.
How many news reports can you actually remember anything?
Yeah.
And commentary.
Yeah, and the word biblical.
And the biblical family now in the 20th
If
century.
anybody's,
After 30
hell
years,
on
you
earth.
still recite that.
that's right.
So if it wasn't this sort of journalistic masterpiece, if it was just mundane with prosaic images, would the Ethiopian famine have not happened? We would not have noticed. Did it take this one piece of journalism?
Well, I mean, that's why I wrote the book. And I mean, there's all sorts of other things which, as you know, if you look at the book, which is there was actually a strike in the independent television at that time. So Michael Burke had a lot more time to write his commentary. He was allowed to fly back to the UK, and he wrote his commentary on the plane. He didn't just go into a cutting room in Nairobi and scribble on the back of an envelope, which he would normally have done. And there was a great cameraman. I mean, Mo Amin was a kind of legendary Kenyan cameraman who filmed those pictures, and that completely made his name.
But there was radio reporter Mike Woodbridge did several reports months before
I know.
this.
I interviewed him.
Saying the same story
Totally.
because of the images, really.
I know.
And just the blue colours.
And the day before this, because Michael Burke took so long to do, he was allowed to fly home, and then he spent a day editing. It's very unusual for a news report. And the radio report went out the day before this onto the Today programme, which this guy Mike Woodbridge did. Nobody batted an eye. It didn't make any impact at all.
Well, we've come to the end of our hour, but we can continue the conversation. There's probably some wine and some things to eat left out there. We can continue talking. And I also wanted to remind you that we will convene again in 2 weeks with 2 journalists covering Africa.